In the year 911 AD, a treaty was signed that would change the course of European history forever. A Viking warlord known as Rollo would trade his longships for a duchy, his raids for rulership, and his Norse gods for Christian baptism. But this transformation would ripple through generations, creating a dynasty that would conquer kingdoms and reshape the medieval world. Who was this enigmatic figure who emerged from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to establish one of medieval Europe's most powerful dynasties? This is the story of Rollo the Walker, a giant among men whose bloodline would flow through the veins of kings, emperors, and conquerors for centuries to come. Our story begins in the late 9th century, during the height of what historians call the Viking Age. From the wind-swept coasts of Norway emerged warriors, traders, and explorers who would terrorize and transform medieval Europe. These were not merely barbarian raiders, but sophisticated seafarers who possessed advanced navigation skills, innovative shipbuilding techniques, and complex social structures that would prove remarkably adaptable to new environments. Born around 860 AD, possibly in the Møre region of western Norway, Rollo, whose Norse name was likely Hrolfr Ragnvaldsson, stood out even among his fellow Vikings. Medieval chronicles describe him as so large and powerful that no horse could carry his weight, earning him the nickname Rollo the Walker, or Gangahrolf in Old Norse. Some sources suggest he stood nearly 7 feet tall, a giant by the standards of his age. The Icelandic sagas tell us that Rollo was the son of Ragnvald Eysteinsson, Earl of Møre, making him nobility by birth. However, his path to power would not come through inheritance, but through the blade of his sword and the cunning of his mind. According to the Heimskringla saga, Rollo was exiled from Norway by King Harald Fairhair around 876 AD for conducting unauthorized raids on Norwegian soil, a banishment that would prove to be one of history's most consequential exiles. Gathering a formidable band of followers, including fellow exiles and ambitious young warriors seeking fortune, Rollo set his sights on the rich lands of Francia. The Frankish kingdoms, weakened by civil wars following the death of Charlemagne and plagued by succession disputes, proved vulnerable to Viking incursions. But Rollo's approach would be different from the typical hit-and-run raids of his contemporaries. Unlike other Viking leaders who preferred coastal raids and quick retreats, Rollo demonstrated strategic brilliance by penetrating deep into Francia via its river systems. The Seine became his highway to wealth and power, allowing his longships to strike far inland where no one expected Viking sails to appear. His forces could appear suddenly, strike hard, and vanish before organized resistance could form. In 885 AD, Rollo achieved what many thought impossible. He laid siege to Paris, the jewel of the Frankish kingdom and one of medieval Europe's most formidable cities. For nearly a year, his forces would hold the city in an iron grip, demonstrating not just Viking ferocity, but also their capacity for sustained, organized warfare. The siege began in November 885 with a spectacular display of Viking naval power. Rollo's fleet of 700 ships carrying perhaps 30,000 warriors blockaded the Seine, their dragon-proud vessels creating a forest of masts that stretched for miles. The defenders, led by the brave Count Odo, held firm behind their walls, but the psychological impact on the population was devastating. Never before had Paris faced such a prolonged and determined assault. Contemporary chronicles describe Rollo not as a savage barbarian, but as a calculating leader who understood the delicate balance between force and diplomacy. When direct assault proved costly and ineffective against Paris's strong fortifications, he adapted his strategy, demonstrating the pragmatic flexibility that would serve him throughout his career. He maintained the siege not just through brute force, but through careful logistics, intelligent use of resources, and psychological warfare. After months of siege, Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with a substantial relief army, but rather than risk a potentially catastrophic battle, he chose the path of negotiation, paying Rollo 700 pounds of silver, an enormous sum that demonstrated the empire's recognition of his power, and granting him passage to raid Burgundy instead. This negotiation revealed Rollo's sophisticated understanding of medieval politics, and his ability to extract maximum advantage from any situation. For the next quarter century, Rollo continued his campaigns throughout northern France, but he was evolving from simple raider to potential ruler. He began to study the political landscape of Francia, learning the complex web of feudal relationships, ecclesiastical power, and royal authority that governed medieval society. Unlike many Viking leaders who remained outsiders, Rollo began to understand how power truly functioned in Christian Europe. During these years of campaigning, Rollo also began to establish the personal relationships that would prove crucial to his later success. Around 886 AD, he entered into a relationship with Poppa of Bayeux, daughter of Berenger, Count of Rennes. This union, whether formal marriage or more informal arrangement, was politically astute, connecting Rollo to established Frankish nobility and demonstrating his intention to integrate into the existing power structure rather than simply destroy it. Poppa would bear Rollo at least 2 children who would prove instrumental in establishing the Norman dynasty. Their son William, who would become known as William Longsword, inherited both his father's political acumen and his mother's understanding of Frankish customs. Their daughter Gerlock, later known as Adele, would marry William III, Duke of Aquitaine, extending Norman influence into southern France and establishing marriage alliances that would strengthen the dynasty for generations. By 911 AD, both Rollo and King Charles the Simple of Francia were exhausted by decades of warfare. The Frankish kingdom had been bled white by constant Viking raids, while Rollo himself was aging and perhaps growing weary of the nomadic life of a raider. The time had come for a revolutionary solution, one that would create the Duchy of Normandy and establish a new model for Viking settlement. The negotiations leading to the Treaty of Saint-Clair sur Epte were complex and delicate, involving not just Rollo and Charles, but also key Frankish nobles, church officials, and even other Viking leaders who had to be convinced to accept Rollo's authority. Charles offered Rollo the lands around Rouen and the lower Seine Valley, territory that Rollo had been raiding for decades and knew intimately. In return, Rollo would accept Christian baptism, swear fealty to the French crown, and most importantly, defend the realm against other Viking incursions. The ceremony itself was laden with symbolism and marked a fundamental transformation in medieval European politics. Rollo, now in his 50s and at the height of his power, was baptized as Robert, a Christian name befitting a Christian duke. However, medieval sources suggest his conversion was more political than spiritual. The chronicler Dudo of Saint-Quentin tells us that on his deathbed, Rollo made sacrifices to both Christ and Odin, suggesting his conversion never fully supplanted his deep-rooted Norse beliefs. As part of the treaty, Rollo also married Gisela, daughter of Charles the Simple, cementing the political alliance through royal blood. This marriage, his second major union, further legitimized his position and provided additional heirs to secure the dynasty's future. Though Gisela died relatively young, their brief marriage produced children who would carry both Viking and Carolingian bloodlines. The new Duchy of Normandy was born, though initially it covered only a fraction of what we know as Normandy today, essentially the area around Rouen and the lower Seine Valley. Rollo would spend his remaining years consolidating power, establishing the administrative structures that would govern his new realm, and most importantly, creating the unique Norman identity that would blend Viking traditions with Frankish customs. Rollo proved to be a remarkably capable administrator, demonstrating that his talents extended far beyond warfare. He established a system of governance that blended Norse customs with Frankish law, creating hybrid institutions that drew on the best of both cultures. Viking military traditions were adapted to serve Christian rulers, while Norse concepts of assembly and consensus were integrated with Frankish feudalism. Perhaps most importantly, Rollo encouraged intermarriage between Norse settlers and local populations, creating the ethnic and cultural fusion that would define Norman identity. Unlike other Viking settlements that remained largely separate from local populations, Normandy became a true melting pot where Norse and Frank, pagan and Christian traditions merged to create something entirely new. Rollo's family arrangements reflected this cultural blending. His various relationships with Poppa of Bayeux, with Gisela of France, and possibly with other noble women, created a complex network of alliances that strengthened Norman rule, while also ensuring genetic and cultural diversity within the ruling class. His children and grandchildren would be raised as both Vikings and Christians, warriors and diplomats, maintaining their Norse heritage while fully embracing their roles as medieval nobles. Rollo died around 928 AD, but his legacy was just beginning to unfold. His son William Longsword succeeded him as Duke of Normandy, but the transition was not without challenges. William faced rebellions from both Norse settlers who thought he had become too Frankish, and from Frankish nobles who refused to accept Viking rule. His assassination in 942 AD nearly ended the Norman experiment before it had truly begun. However, William's young son, Richard the Fearless, managed to survive the political turmoil and establish the Norman dynasty on firm foundations. Richard expanded Norman territory, incorporated Viking military innovations into medieval warfare, and established the cultural patterns that would define Normandy for centuries. Under his rule, Normandy became not just a duchy, but a laboratory for military, architectural, and administrative innovations that would eventually spread across Europe. The third generation of Rollo's dynasty would prove even more remarkable. Richard the Fearless's son, Richard the Good, established Normandy as one of medieval Europe's most prosperous and stable duchies. He patronized learning, supported monastic reform, and created the economic foundations that would fund later Norman expansion. More importantly, he established the marriage alliances that would eventually place Norman blood in royal houses across Europe. But it was Rollo's great-great-great-grandson who would achieve the most spectacular success. William the Conqueror, born around 1028 AD, inherited not just Norman lands but also the military innovations, administrative skills, and political cunning that had been refined over generations since Rollo first set foot in Francia. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 was not just William's victory, it was the culmination of 150 years of Norman development that began with Rollo's decision to settle, rather than simply raid. The Norman conquest of England represented the full flowering of Rollo's legacy. The military tactics used at Hastings combined cavalry and infantry attacks, sophisticated siege warfare, coordinated logistics, all built upon innovations that began with Viking warfare but had been refined through generations of Norman experience. The administrative systems William imposed on England drew directly from the hybrid Norse-Frankish institutions that Rollo had established in Normandy. But William the Conqueror was not the only descendant to achieve greatness. Rollo's bloodlines spread throughout medieval Europe through strategic marriages and conquest. Tancred de Hauteville, a Norman knight descended from Rollo's line, established Norman kingdoms in southern Italy and Sicily. His sons, including the legendary Bohemond of Antioch and Robert Guiscard, conquered vast territories in the Mediterranean and played crucial roles in the Crusades. The genetic legacy of Rollo extends even further through European history. Through William the Conqueror, Rollo's blood flows in the veins of every subsequent English monarch. The Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled England for over 300 years, traced their lineage directly back to the Viking giant who was too large for any horse. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most powerful women, carried Norman blood through her marriage to Henry II. Even more remarkably, genetic studies suggest that Rollo's Y chromosome lineage may have spread far beyond the noble families of medieval Europe. The rapid expansion of Norman influence, combined with the Viking tradition of taking multiple wives and concubines, means that millions of modern Europeans may carry genetic traces of the first Duke of Normandy. The cultural legacy proves equally enduring. The Norman architectural style, which blended Viking woodworking traditions with Romanesque stone construction, produced some of medieval Europe's most magnificent buildings. The administrative innovations pioneered in Normandy, detailed record-keeping, centralized tax collection, professional bureaucracy, became models for emerging nation-states across Europe. Norman legal traditions, combining Viking concepts of individual rights with Frankish feudalism, influenced the development of common law systems that persist to this day. The English legal system, transplanted to former British colonies around the world, carries within it echoes of legal concepts that Rollo first adapted from Norse tradition to Frankish reality. Perhaps most importantly, the Norman example demonstrated that Viking culture was not inherently destructive, but remarkably adaptable. Rollo showed that Norse warriors could become Christian knights, that Viking raiders could transform into capable administrators, and that pagan traditions could blend with Christian civilization to create something stronger than either alone. Today, visitors to Rouen can see Rollo's tomb in the cathedral that bears witness to his transformation from pagan raider to Christian duke. The cathedral itself embodies the cultural fusion he initiated, built on foundations that may have once supported a Viking temple. Constructed in Norman Romanesque style that blends Norse and Frankish traditions, decorated with carvings that tell both Christian stories and echo Norse mythological themes. But perhaps Rollo's greatest monument is not stone, but the Norman culture that emerged from his bold decision to settle rather than simply destroy. From the fjords of Norway to the fields of Normandy, from the castles of England to the palaces of Sicily, his influence reshaped the medieval world. The Viking, who was too large for any horse, became the founder of a dynasty that would stride across continents. Modern genetic research has added fascinating new dimensions to Rollo's story. DNA analysis of his putative descendants suggests that he may have belonged to the R1b-U106 haplogroup, common among Scandinavian populations. More intriguingly, this genetic signature appears throughout Europe, in populations that correlate with areas of known Norman influence, suggesting that Rollo's biological legacy may be even more widespread than historical records indicate. Archaeological evidence from Normandy reveals the material culture of Rollo's transformation. Excavations at Rouen have uncovered layers showing the gradual transition from Viking material culture to hybrid Norse-Frankish artifacts. Weapons evolved from pure Viking designs to incorporate Frankish elements. Jewelry shows similar cultural blending. Even cooking implements and household items reflect the cultural fusion that Rollo initiated. The linguistic legacy persists as well. Norman French, the language that developed in Rollo's duchy, became the language of English courts for centuries after the conquest. Thousands of English words derive from Norman French, which itself incorporated Norse terms that Rollo's followers brought from Scandinavia. When we speak of government, justice, nobility, or honor, we are using words that trace their origins to the cultural synthesis that began with Rollo's treaty. Rollo the Walker had found his destination at last, not through conquest alone, but through the wisdom to know when to stop walking and start building. His journey from the fjords of Norway to the throne of Normandy represents one of history's most remarkable personal transformations. But more than that, it exemplifies the adaptability and ambition that made the Viking Age one of the most dynamic periods in human history. From pagan temples to Christian cathedrals, from dragon-prowed longships to stone castles, from Viking raids to royal dynasties, Rollo's story reminds us that history's greatest transformations often come not from destruction, but from the courage to embrace change and begin anew. In choosing to build rather than merely destroy, to settle rather than simply raid, to adapt rather than merely conquer, Rollo created a legacy that would echo through the centuries and shape the destiny of nations yet unborn.